This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about something quieter and much more dangerous, because what failed here did not fail loudly. It failed politely, on paper, through procedures that looked routine, through decisions that felt reasonable at the time. Nothing collapsed all at once. Nothing triggered alarms. The system kept working, just not for the people it was meant to protect. And that's the problem. When danger wears credentials, it doesn't rush. It waits. It embeds. It learns how authority actually moves, who signs, who delays, who doesn't ask questions. By the time violence shows up, the damage is already old. If you've ever assumed that institutions break with noise, stay with me. Because this story only makes sense once you understand how silence becomes infrastructure. Tap like if you want to understand how this really works. Because the next part is where the illusion starts to crack, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. What actually controls a system like this is not force. It's not ideology. It's not even money, at least not at first. It's permission. Permission created by process, by paperwork that moves slower than harm, by authority fragmented just enough that no one feels responsible for the whole outcome. In this system, power doesn't sit at the top. It circulates through signatures, through discretionary pauses, through the quiet ability to say, not yet, and have that mean forever. Personalities don't matter as much as position. Any individual can be replaced. What cannot be replaced is access. Access to delay, access to redirect, access to make something technically unresolved instead of explicitly wrong. That's how control shifts without anyone voting on it. The system doesn't get taken over, it gets repurposed. And once protection becomes procedural, it stops looking like protection at all. It looks like normal operations. That's where the real danger begins, because now the system isn't failing. It's functioning exactly as redesigned. And in the next part, you'll see how that redesign happened so slowly that almost no one noticed. There was a time when warning signs triggered action, when anomalies were treated as problems, not paperwork, when delays raised questions instead of excuses. That time didn't end with a vote. It ended with normalization. Little changes, justified changes, each one defensible on its own. A form routed differently, a priority quietly downgraded. A case labeled complex instead of urgent. A review postponed because resources were stretched. Before, friction meant scrutiny. Now friction means patience. Before, silence meant something was wrong. Now silence means the system is working. That's the shift. Not collapse. Adaptation. The most dangerous systems don't break. They acclimate. They learn how much pressure they can absorb without triggering oversight. They learn which alarms matter and which ones can be ignored indefinitely. And the people inside them don't feel like they're doing harm. They feel like they're following process, protecting stability, avoiding overreaction. That's how damage becomes ambient, how harm stretches across years instead of days. By the time consequences arrive, they feel disconnected, unrelated, unavoidable, but they aren't. Because in the next part, we're going to hit the moment when that quiet shift produces its first undeniable shock. The first shock never looks like the system failing. It looks like an exception, a moment so sharp it forces attention, so visible it can't be routed quietly. Something breaks through the surface. Suddenly there is urgency, movement, statements. Explanations offered faster than questions can form. You're told this is about a single incident, a single decision, a single response under pressure. That framing is comforting because it implies containment. But notice what happens next. The response expands instead of resolves. What should narrow widens. What should conclude multiplies. One action triggers another, then another. And instead of clarity, there's scale. More personnel, more resources, more doors open that were never meant to be opened at all. And that's when the pattern starts to show. Not because someone planned for it to be visible, but because the system can no longer keep it isolated. If this were truly an anomaly, it would end here, cleanly, quickly, but it doesn't. And if you're assuming this shock is the story, stay with me. Because what it exposes next is far more destabilizing than the event itself. Tap like if you're still with me. Because the next part is where the machinery finally comes into view. Here's what that machinery looks like once you stop mistaking it for chaos. It's not improvisation, it's not negligence, it's design through accumulation. A system where risk is pushed downward, where exposure is absorbed by the least protected layers, and where benefit moves upward, quietly, legally, invisibly. Those who profit don't touch the damage. They don't handle the violence. They don't absorb the fallout. They manage distance created by intermediaries, by legal insulation, by roles that only interact with consequences as data points, not lived reality. When something goes wrong, the cost disperses across neighborhoods, across years, across people who will never be in the same room as the decisions that harm them. But when something goes right for the system, the rewards consolidate, influence deepens, access expands. Protection becomes normalized. This is how harm becomes sustainable, not because no one knows, but because knowing doesn't trigger responsibility. Once accountability is optional, delay becomes a currency. And delay, used correctly, is indistinguishable from immunity. That's the mechanism. And it doesn't need bad intentions to function. It only needs time. In the next part, you'll see what happens when this machine is forced to move faster than it was designed to. When the system is pushed, it doesn't respond with clarity. It responds with speed. Faster movement, shorter timelines, compressed decisions. And that's when things get dangerous. Because systems built on delay don't degrade gracefully, they snap. There's no room for careful routing anymore, no space to slow walk consequences. Everything collides at once. Pressure exposes what had been hidden by time. Connections that never appeared related suddenly line up. Paths that were never meant to intersect do. The response becomes reactive, not strategic. Containment replaces understanding. You start to see resistance. Not always violent, sometimes procedural, files missing, access revoked, questions redirected. The pace makes it hard to tell what's obstruction and what's panic. That ambiguity is itself a shield. And while attention stays fixed on movement, the system sheds responsibility wherever it can. Blame fragments. Narratives compete. Oversight lags behind action. This is the moment when errors compound, when collateral damage becomes likely, when trust erodes in real time. If you're waiting for resolution here, you won't get it. Because acceleration doesn't fix structural failure. It amplifies it, and in the next part, we're going to stop looking at the system and look at where it lands. This is where it reaches you, not as a headline, not as a briefing, as disruption. You feel it as instability, as rules that don't seem to apply the same way twice, as consequences that arrive without warning and without explanation. You're told to trust the process, but the process keeps changing shape. You're told safeguards exist, but they activate only after damage is done. What you absorb is not the event itself. It's the uncertainty around it. You adjust behavior, you lower expectations, you stop assuming protection is automatic. That's the quiet cost. When systems fail this way, they don't just produce victims. They produce adaptation, people learning how to live around dysfunction instead of confronting it. That's not resilience. That's normalization. If this feels abstract, it isn't. It shows up in delayed responses, in uneven enforcement, in consequences that seem arbitrary rather than just. And once that feeling sets in, it spreads, because trust, once fractured, doesn't localize. If this resonates, stay with me, because the next part is where you see how this instability moves beyond borders you thought contained it. What happens next is the part systems never like to admit. Instability doesn't stay put. When one node starts absorbing damage quietly, pressure redistributes. Roots shift. Burden moves. Risk looks for softer ground. What was once local becomes portable. Procedures designed for one jurisdiction start affecting others. Decisions made to manage a problem in one place create blind spots somewhere else. And because the system is interconnected, those blind spots line up. You don't see coordination, you see coincidence, similar failures, similar delays, similar explanations offered in different accents. This is how erosion travels, not through invasion, through imitation. Once a system proves it can absorb harm without consequence, others learn from it. The lesson spreads faster than any reform. Oversight weakens in parallel. Trust thins across institutions that have never met but operate the same way. And suddenly, what felt contained now feels familiar everywhere. There is no single lever to pull anymore. No central fix. Only feedback loops that reinforce the same behavior at scale. And here's the unsettling part. The system doesn't recognize this as a crisis. It recognizes it as stability. In the next part, we're going to look forward. Not to predict what will happen, but to understand the paths now open. From here, the future doesn't move in a straight line. It branches. There are 3 paths, all of them plausible, none of them clean. The first is adjustment, surface reform, new language, new oversight units, enough change to relieve pressure without altering how power actually circulates. The system survives by appearing responsive. Damage slows, but the underlying incentives remain intact. The second path is erosion. Quieter, more familiar. Rules still exist, but enforcement becomes selective. Accountability becomes conditional. Trust thins gradually until expectations reset downward. Nothing breaks dramatically. People simply stop assuming protection is guaranteed. And then there is rupture. That's the path systems never plan for. When accumulated delay collapses into simultaneity. When multiple failures intersect faster than authority can contain them. When legitimacy evaporates in real time. Rupture doesn't announce itself. It arrives as confusion, conflicting orders, competing narratives, a sudden loss of coherence. Which path unfolds depends on decisions being made right now, mostly out of sight, mostly justified as temporary. None of these outcomes are inevitable, but none are hypothetical either, because the conditions that produce this moment are still in place. And in the final part, we're going to end where this actually leaves you. This is where the story stops giving answers. Not because there aren't any, but because resolution is the illusion that caused the damage in the first place. Systems like this don't collapse when people stop believing in them. They collapse when people assume they don't need watching. What you've seen here is not an aberration. It's a pattern that only becomes visible when pressure exceeds patience. The danger isn't that corruption exists. It always has. The danger is when it becomes procedural, when it hides inside normal operations, when no one feels responsible because everyone is technically compliant. That's how trust dissolves without a single dramatic moment, how harm accumulates without a villain, how silence becomes the most effective form of protection. If you're waiting for reassurance, you won't get it here, because comfort is what lets systems drift. What matters now is attention, sustained, uncomfortable, refusing to be satisfied with surface fixes or symbolic accountability. If you want to understand where this goes next, stay with me, share this, follow the thread, because the next story won't look the same. It never does. And if you stop watching, that's exactly when systems like this feel safest.